Question: is America a Christian country? The answer is absolutely not. Um, Actually, America is a secular nation, meaning there is a separation of church and state, and we owe that to two of our founding presidents, our third and fourth presidents. That's Thomas Jefferson and his brilliant protege, James Madison. My name's Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about US presidents, and I'm going to talk about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison today. Briefly, importantly, about the work they did regarding our First Amendment. Our First Amendment, separates the church and state, and with the what's called the Establishment Clause, that means the state, the government is prohibited from establishing a religion or favoring one religious practice over another. And the exercise clause, it protects citizens to freely exercise their religion. So let me start off by talking about the religious beliefs of our founding presidents. Most people think that our founding presidents were Christians. That's not accurate. Some of them were. Some of them, like they say, John Jay or Patrick Henry, they were devout Christians. But most people don't know John Jay and Patrick Henry. Most people know George Washington. George Washington, as I said, belonged in the Freemason Society. Many Freemasons actually are deists, right? They're not exactly Christians. You can be a Christian. There's something called Christian deist. But many of our founding fathers were deists, right? Benjamin Franklin was, George Washington was, even John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, most notably, was a deist. So deists, right, believe in a creator God. They believe in a creator God, but they also believe that this creator God is far from interacting with human beings. It doesn't interact with nature. That He's created, the world and set principles and rules, and they already exist. And so deists instead follow the exercise of reason and logic, right? They bank on reason, logic, and natural laws. So that's what deists basically follow. So they're not necessarily like Christians who believe in the Trinity or believe in divine intervention or miracles. No, deists don't believe in any of that. So many of our founding fathers were deists. Now, so back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Now, both of these men were from Virginia, right? And Virginia had the Church of England as its established church. And you have to remember that our revolution was against the king, right? The King of England, the King of Britain. And guess who the head of the Church of England is? The King of England, the British monarch. So one of the things that these people in Virginia did was they de-established the Church of England, as their church, and so they were the first, I believe, to establish the separation of church and state in the colonies. And so this they later transferred into our First Amendment, in our Constitution. All right. Remember, James Madison gave us the Bill of Rights, and Thomas Jefferson persuaded him in writing these Bill of Rights, because many of the southern states did not want to ratify the Constitution of 1787. I think some of the condition that a lot of the people in Virginia used for the required for the ratification was persuading James Madison to write the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights includes the first 10 amendments. And the first amendment, includes the separation it incorporates the separation of church and state. And as I mentioned earlier, with respect to religion, it has the establishment clause, which says that the government cannot establish any religion or favor any religious practice over another. And then it has the free exercise clause, which says that the government protects every individual's right to practice their religion. So, so Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they were very proactive with regard to people being able to freely exercise their religious beliefs. In fact, James Madison said that conscience is the most sacred of property. Right? This is something attributed to James Madison. He said, conscience is the most sacred of property. And so these two men, they were very forceful in their beliefs that our individual beliefs should be free from government intrusion. And so we're fortunate that they put that separation of church and state condition in our First Amendment. So indeed, the United States is not a Christian nation, but every religion everyone is free to exercise their religion, whether it's Islam, whether it's Christianity. You're not prohibited from practicing religion, and you're not encouraged to practice any religion. It's up to you. So that's what they gave us. That's Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Now, something else that they did that I just wanted to quickly mention is earlier videos that I'd made, I had talked about nullification, and I talked about John Calhoun, who was Andrew Jackson's vice president before they fell out. Remember, John Calhoun is the first person to have resigned as a vice president. Spiro Agnew did it later on under Richard Nixon. Spiro Agnew was a former governor of Maryland, and due to a corruption scandal, while he was vice president to Richard Nixon, he resigned. So he was the second vice president to resign. But the first vice president to resign was John Calhoun. And John Calhoun, had been the leader of the nullifiers in South Carolina. And remember, they were advocating nullification, that the states had the authority to nullify an unconstitutional law made by the federal government. And they didn't create that doctrine. That doctrine was actually first formulated or proposed, at least in the Americas, by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Right? This came about after, the Alien and Seditions Act of 1798, which was enacted by President John Adams. President John Adams was our second president, and this came about during the quasi-war between America and France, right? And so John Adams, made that very, very unpopular and almost autocratic law, and the issue was a national security interest. So that's probably one of the first times that a president, the executive, was creating laws based on national security. And so, of course, there was this impasse between America and France, and so John Adams, he passed the Alien and Seditions Act. And the man I really, really like and respect, Alexander Hamilton, he supported it, and I think he was the main person who advocated, I believe, the Alien and Seditions Act. And so the idea was regarding aliens, it was to be able to expel immigrants, right? And then in terms of the sedition, you couldn't criticize the government, right? It made it treason, to criticize the government. And so people who were journalists, they were summarily rounded up and locked up, during that time. And so the backlash was that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who'd become vocal. And remember I talked about how our founding fathers wrote a lot, and their method, their style was, if they wanted to criticize a government, they would do it in the newspapers. They would write anonymously. I think Thomas Jefferson's pseudonym was Long Tom, right, and Sage of Monticello. Those were two of his pseudonyms. It was not uncommon for our founding fathers to have multiple pseudonyms. And remember, I mentioned that John Adams' pseudonym was Novanglus, and Humphrey Plow Jogger. James Monroe's pseudonym was Aratus. Was it Atterus or Aratus, something like that? And what's his name? James Madison's pseudonym was Publius, right? Which he used in the Federalist Papers. And so they also had proxies, right? Thomas Jefferson, for instance, while he was vice president, and I think even when he became president, he sponsored a newspaper, right? He sponsored a newspaper. He was actually using government funds to secretly sponsor a newspaper that was attacking his opponents. And the other side, the Federalists, did this as well. And so there was this war of words, a lot of vitriol, invective, and journalists were their proxies at the time. And so John Adams created the Alien and Seditions Act. And so the backlash was that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they went ahead and they did what was called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. That's James Madison wrote the Virginia resolutions, and Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolutions. And that was they were basically saying that the states, right, had the power to nullify an offensive law made by the federal government. And so the offshoot of that was, that created the precedent later on for people in this, state authorities to later say that, well, they could nullify, laws by the government. And of course, we saw that with the nullification crisis in the 1830s over tariffs, which John Calhoun led against Andrew Jackson. And, Andrew Jackson wasn't one who raised tariffs originally, what was called the tariffs of abominations. It was actually John Quincy Adams during his administration. But again, Andrew Jackson, he was a complex man. He would exercise, a very forceful executive power, and he was against the nullifiers and said, that the states cannot nullify. It would be treason for the states to, invalidate a law by the federal government. And in fact, he was willing to use the military to enforce federal laws in the states. And so later on, that was also a seed that would eventually lead to the Civil War, ultimately, of 1861 to 1865. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And so, that was a little bit unpopular, but importantly, what they did on the positive side was the separation of church and state embodied in the First Amendment, right? And that's principally the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, right? The Establishment Clause just means the government cannot establish a religion, and they can't prohibit the exercise of religion. And the free exercise, that just means it protects, citizens, individuals from freely, it protects them to freely exercise their religion. So my name's Oluroti Miosha. I like to talk about U.S. presidents, and I also use the opportunity to talk about the abusive process which I've been experiencing and suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland, which has been pivoted on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court. And it's been violating my 14th Amendment rights. I started off violating my 4th Amendment rights. Now, what does the 4th Amendment right? 4th Amendment prohibits the unreasonable search and seizure. It prohibits unreasonable search and seizure by the government without a warrant, right? Without a warrant from a neutral judge. So Again, Fourth Amendment, that's another example of what's incorporated in the Bill of Rights. Remember, the first 10 amendments are, the first 10 amendments constitute our Bill of Rights, and that was famously authored by James Madison. Um, there's more I can say about these two presidents, but I want to keep it, tight uh, and keep it short. As I mentioned, most of our founding fathers were deists. They were not Christians. Fortunately, they didn't prevent the exercise of religion or our religious beliefs, but they did separate church and state because they knew the risk and the tyranny that could arise when we had a theological state, a theocracy, and people weren't allowed to freely exercise their religion. And one religion could actually tyrannize other people because they just didn't, accede to their own religious beliefs. Again, my name is Oluro Timosha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.